We have a question actually. Hi James, how would you feel about keeping no fault but making it so the person who leaves the marriage for no reason gives up their claim on marital assets,
Yeah.
alimony, first dibs on custody?
Hey, welcome back. This is Shah. The clip you just watched was me asking James Sexton, the legendary family law attorney who went viral recently on his interview with the Soft White Underbelly channel. He's been making the rounds and he lends a valuable insight into the marriage divorce problem with his expertise. So I found him on this podcast called Cognitive Vigilance Podcast. They're a pretty small channel, so maybe go show them some support and give them a subscribe. But I saw him on this podcast and it had a relatively small amount of viewers. So I'm like, I'm going to see if I can ask James Sexton a question. And I asked it and he answered it, which is pretty freaking cool. So before I get into his answer of the question, I just wanted to discuss a little bit the basis of why I asked that. And then we can hear his answer and then see what we think about it. So the reason I asked it was because a lot of the times, especially in this corner of the internet, you hear calls for abolish no-fault divorce. Let's go back to at-fault divorce. And that's typically, uttered by traditional conservatives. You can say like Matt Walsh, Steven Crowder, Michael Knowles. They all look at no-fault divorce and they'll say, this has been terrible for marriage. And, maybe that's true to some extent. But they'll ask, hey, let's try to get this changed and get rid of no-fault, and that should save marriage. What's interesting is that guys like James Sexton tend to have a different view. And they think it's more so inappropriate to do that.
Like, I think it has to be something that, because I don't think barriers to exit is the solution. I don't think that like this idea of eradicating
marriage is the barrier to exit. Marriage is the barrier to exit. That's the whole point.
Well, it's a barrier to relationship expert in right. It's a barrier to terminating a relationship easily. I get that, but it's not really like barriers to exit is not what we need. Like all of these guys that say like, oh, we have to get rid of no-fault divorce. That's like saying like, oh, we have to get rid of all these emergency rooms because there's all these sick people in them. And that way people won't be sick anymore. And it's like, well, that's fucking ridiculous.
A cough causing a cold.
Yeah, it's the joke I make where like at the end of the day when I'm tired, I'll say to my staff, I'm like, all right, I'm going home. These fucking people can stay married for all I care. And I'll just leave, and because the joke is like, it's not like if I quit tomorrow, these people will be like, well, now we've got to stay married. Sexton's not here anymore to get us divorced. Like they'll find someone else to get them divorced, or they'll just do what we used to call an Irish divorce. You go out for milk and never come back. You just leave, and then you don't sort your shit out.
I find this interesting because it just really goes against the grain as far as an answer is concerned. Because on the surface level, it does seem like getting rid of no-fault divorce would do a lot of good. So let's talk a little bit about the differences between at-fault divorce and no-fault divorce. And I think once we understand that, we might be able to look at James's answer and better understand what he's trying to say. So this right here is a paper called No-Fault Divorce Legislation and Its Impact on State Divorce Rates. This was actually published in 1981. And that was by Elizabeth Ann Massey for the College of William and Mary. And it's an older paper, but I think it's important because it helps get us into the frame of mind of what the academics and scholars and other legal professionals were thinking when they made, this change from at-fault to no-fault divorce in the first place. And one of the things that I accept is the people who were involved in this process are, very intelligent people, and it's not just one or two people. It's an assembly of people who are coming together and saying, hey, this is supposed to work better than the system we had. And I think, listening to people at the surface level understanding could be kind of harmful because we could find ourselves in a position that's even worse if we don't at least see what these people were saying. So I'm going to read from this section onward. No-fault divorce legislation was designed in part to correct for perceived shortcomings in the existing laws. Two areas of particular concern were the issues of personal trauma and of system abuse. Typically, when you wanted a divorce during at-fault times, you had to go into court, which is basically a public setting, and you had to kind of air out all of your dirty laundry in order to prove that the other party, committed a fault and that the judge should grant the divorce. And this could include, adultery, cruelty and abuse, all these things. So you have to take the stand, get cross-examined, and basically put yourself out there, which did have a kind of personal trauma associated with it. The second thing that's mentioned is system abuse. So system abuse can be summed up, I'd say, by perjury and collusion. So what that means is that, you're going in court and you're basically lying. You're perjuring. And the reason this was such a big issue was because there was a lot of people who wanted to get divorced, but they couldn't because one or the other party hadn't really done anything that qualified for a divorce. They hadn't cheated, they weren't beating anybody. They didn't abandon their partner, their spouse, And so what you saw a lot of the times were people who wanted to get divorced, but the court wouldn't allow it. Because if two people just wanted to not be together, the court said, too bad, you guys got to be together because a married family is more important for society than just letting people get willy-nilly divorced. So they didn't want to be there anymore, but too bad, you took your vows. Well, people who are in that situation weren't happy about it. So family law attorneys got pretty wise to that, and they would help, their clients basically lie their way through the system. This is the Wikipedia for no-fault divorce, and there's a section that's pretty interesting here that explains this. It's called Bypassing the Showing of Fault Requirements for Divorce. These requirements could be problematic if both spouses were at fault or if neither spouse had committed a legally culpable act, but both spouses desired a divorce by mutual consent. Lawyers began to advise their clients on how to manufacture quote-unquote legal fictions to bypass the statutory requirements, with the result that by the 1920s, the actual operation of the legal system was completely at odds with statute and case law. One method popular in New York was referred to as collusive adultery, in which the husband would check into a hotel with a quote-unquote mistress obtained for the occasion. A photographer, also obtained for the occasion, would suddenly appear out of nowhere to take snapshots of the husband and his mistress in flagrant delicto, meaning that, you were caught red-handed with the mistress, and we got photo evidence for the courts to see. Upon presentation of the photos in court, the judge would convict the husband of adultery and the couple could be divorced. In many other states, especially California, the most popular allegation for divorce was cruelty, which was then unavailable in New York. For example, in 1950, wives pleaded cruelty as the basis for 70% of San Francisco divorce cases. Wives would regularly testify to the same facts. Their husbands swore at them, hit them, and generally treated them terribly. This procedure was described by Supreme Court of California Associate Justice Stanley Mosk. Every day, in every superior court in the state, the same melancholy charade was played. The innocent spouse, generally the wife, would take the stand and, to the accompanying cacophony of sobbing and nose-blowing, testify under the deft guidance of an attorney to the spousal conduct that she deemed cruel. So that's kind of interesting. So basically people were like, man, we don't want to be married anymore, and this system sucks. So they'd go into court, and they would just lie their way out of it. One party would say, I was the bad guy, and that's how they'd get their divorce through. Eventually, this problem was so pervasive that the, experts that were looking at this were like, there's just such a flagrant regard, for the law here that we might as well just update the laws to reflect what people are actually doing so people don't have to go into court and lie. Just to go back to this paper, so we're not completely relying on Wikipedia, I'm going to start reading from here. The fault system is attacked as being hypocritical on the grounds that it not only tolerates perjury and collusion, but actually encourages such actions. Couples who do not have legally acceptable grounds for divorce, but who wish to terminate their marriage, frequently fabricate evidence and perjure themselves in court. Such action is commonplace, and Wheeler states that most people in the legal profession accept as axiomatic the notion that perjury is the rule in divorce courts. The facts that everyone is involved, including the couples and their lawyers and the judges, results in a sham in the courtroom and contributes to disrespect for the legal process. Timothy Walker discusses this behavior as an example of law accommodation, a pattern of normative deviation that occurs when there is a breakdown in the ability of a law or rule to command adherence on the basis of its own utility. If we look at this for what it is, we have personal trauma, we have perjury and collusion, abuse of the system, and then another reason that's not really mentioned is just how expensive and bulky it is to get a divorce through the courts if you're going by the at-fault system. It costs a lot of money. It would go to trial. all these things, and it made it really hard to divorce, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think the traditional conservatives in this situation would say, hey, that's good, because people shouldn't be getting divorced. It should be hard to get divorced. But there was a growing hunger to get divorced in our culture and society at that time, so it made no-fault divorce, or that legislation, just seem really attractive to people. And one thing I find interesting is, I used to work at the Department of Child Support Services in Sacramento. Across the street was the Superior Court for Sacramento. It was called William Ridgway. And if you walk inside by the metal detector, if you look to the left, I remember this. I don't know if it's still there because it's been like 5 years, but there was a picture and it said home of the original one-day divorce. And I didn't know what that meant when I worked there. I was like, why would they talk about a divorce like it's a hamburger or, something from like McDonald's or Burger King? But after reading all this, I kind of get why that sign is there, because it's basically saying, hey, like, you can come in here and get divorced in a day instead of having to go through this lengthy, very expensive trial. So that's what helped no-fault divorce take off in the first place. One of the problems I have with no-fault divorce is that when it comes to splitting up, the assets, when it comes to alimony and all this kind of stuff, since there's no fault associated with either party, everything just gets kind of split, 50-50. California's a community property state. And, a lot of the guys that, who've been through divorces and stuff like that, this is the stuff that's most painful for them. And they say, no fault divorce makes it too easy for someone to just, pull the parachute and take half the stuff and leave. And one of the things about at-fault divorce that they like is the fact that once fault is proven, that has a bearing on how the assets of the marriage, or how alimony and stuff like that is ordered by the judge. So if you're the victim, then that means that, you might be able to keep the house. You might not have to pay alimony, or if, you as the supporting party was the one who cheated, then you know what? She gets the house, the alimony, no question about that. And you're going to get the book thrown at you. So in that sense, it's a little bit better than no fault. This is a table, and it's from a document which was prepared for the California Assembly Judiciary Committee for the legislature in the mid-90s. And, California was the first state in the U.S. to pass no fault divorce back in 1969. And in the mid-90s, it had come up again in discussion at the legislature here in Sacramento, and they were basically, assessing like, hey, was it a good thing we did? Was it a bad thing we did? I mean, clearly they figured it was good because they didn't change it back. But this document has a very, interesting chart here. We won't spend too much time on it. The part that I find interesting is this top part, and then also the financial awards part. So, it says here that at-fault divorce on the left side of this chart was specifically to protect marriage. It's supposed to be hard to get divorced, right? Where no-fault divorce is to facilitate divorce. That's how we get the, home of the one-day divorce, with a actual superior court in California being proud of it. Now, the other important part to me is the financial awards. In traditional at-fault divorce, financial awards are linked to fault, meaning that alimony for the quote-unquote innocent spouse, or great share of property to the innocent spouse. Now, that could be anybody. That could be the husband who's the provider, and he's the one who got, victimized here, right? Oh my God, he was cheated on. So that he's going to get a bigger share of the property, which to me sounds pretty fair. But when you get to the no-fault side of it, it's properties divided equally, alimony's based off of need, and fault doesn't really play into this. So, it's just an interesting thing to me, and this is essentially the basis for what formed my question to James Sexton. So let's take a look at his answer and see what he had to say about it.
We have a question, actually. Hi, James. How would you feel about keeping no fault, but making it so the person who leaves the marriage for no reason gives up their claim on marital assets, alimony, first dibs on custody?
Yeah, so here's the problem. How do you prove that someone left a marriage for no reason? Like, see, lawyers don't care what you know. We care what you can prove. And the truth sometimes is at the bottom of a bottomless pit. And the problem with anything that's fault-based is you have to be able to prove it. And a lot of what happens in a marriage happens behind closed doors. and people don't beat their spouse in front of other people. They don't, like, so even like adultery, like most people don't do that in public. Like most of the time. So what we used to do when you had to prove adultery is you'd have to show what was called inclination and opportunity, which meant you'd have to show through some evidence that these people appeared to have a very affectionate relationship, that they had the inclination to potentially sleep together. And then you had to show that they had the opportunity to sleep together. So that's where like the idea
Was that enough
of a private investigator with the binoculars and the camera came into the zeitgeist, right? So the truth is that, like, if you try to tie anything economic or anything related to the kids to whose fault it was that the marriage ended, like and I'm not trying to play devil's advocate here, but if I say, okay, well, if you cheat, you lose custody or you lose alimony. Well, what if I cheat because you refuse to have sex with me and haven't had sex with me in 3 years? Or what if you don't even talk to me and I just assumed that, okay. Or what if the cheating that I do is that I go and get a hand job at one of those massage places, right? Where I don't even know the person's name. I'm not having intercourse with them. It's not, I think we can all agree it's not the same as having... Right, but it's not the same thing as like having a girlfriend and like having feelings for the person. This is an anonymous transaction to some degree, and it's not even an exchange of bodily fluids between two people. So, the point becomes like you get into this very thorny ground of like, what's the burden of proof? How much proof do you need? How egregious does the fault have to be to merit the relief requested? Because here's what I'll tell you. Like, if you cheat, I don't think you should lose custody of your kids.
Yeah.
It just means you're a shitty husband or a shitty wife. Doesn't mean you're a bad
I agree
father.
with you 100%.
Like just because okay, you can cook, does that mean you can farm? Like the skill set for a father and the skill set for a husband is totally different. I can tell you, I'm a shitty husband. I'm impatient. I'm a workaholic. I don't like sleeping in a bed with another person. Like, I got a whole list of things. I don't know what to do at strip clubs. That might make me a good husband. But like, there's a whole list of things. There's a whole list of things that make me a shitty husband, but I'm a really good dad. My ex-wife jokes with me all the time. She's like, you were a terrible husband. You're an awesome ex-husband.
So he gave a pretty comprehensive answer. The first part of that I thought was interesting. And he says, how would you prove someone is leaving a marriage for no reason? And my answer to that would be that, well, if a person is filing, under no fault, then they're kind of implicitly saying, hey, I'm just leaving this marriage for no reason. The legalese that constitutes no fault is this: the current grounds for divorce in California, irreconcilable differences which have caused the irremediable breakdown of the marriage. And that's a pretty gray area, blurry, kind of thing. It's just made to be really open and general so people can get a no-fault divorce through. But I would say, it's already inherent that if someone is filing a no-fault divorce, they're basically saying they want to leave the marriage, not for any real reason, especially not for anything like adultery, abandonment, and cruelty and abuse, and these kinds of things that were associated with at-fault divorce. So I would say it probably would be pretty easy to prove that they're doing it for no reason if they're filing a no-fault divorce. As to the rest of his answer, I do agree with a lot of it. I think it is really hard and cumbersome and even expensive to prove a fault in a divorce. And I can see why we went to no fault in the first place. I think he answered the question like any good attorney would. I mean, I'd imagine if you're an attorney and someone's saying, hey, my spouse is divorcing me, they're saying I cheated, his first question might be, okay, but why did you cheat though? Was it really your fault? Did they push you to cheat? Did they keep you in a dead bedroom for 10 years? I mean, all these kinds of things. And that would be how he would argue it, which is really fascinating to hear. Because you can see how it would get really wiry and horrible and how a no-fault divorce might look more attractive in the first place. The part that, I think is interesting is that, we have a lot of people calling to change this system. There is a lot of frustration, especially on the side of the man, which I wouldn't even say really is man, but typically on the side of the masculine provider role. Because in some cases, it is the woman who's making the money and they have to pay alimony or child support. I've seen it happen. But for that side, you know, the supporting party in that, you know, marriage tends to get the raw end of the deal there. And James Sexton himself discusses marriage as an outdated technology for a lot of those reasons. And, you know, I do agree with him on all that stuff. So I still think we should reform no-fault divorce in some way. And I don't think he exactly showed why we couldn't do it in the way that I suggested. I'd love to talk to James Sexton. I think it'd be really interesting to pick his brain and hear more about what he'd have to say. I think ultimately it comes down to having to accept that, you know, no one person has the solution for this. This is an incredibly complex problem. And, you know, the solution is not as easy as, you know, taking the red pill or taking the Christ pill. We have an incredibly complex and bulky system of laws and protocols and procedures that govern marriage and divorce. And ultimately, you know, the people who put these guidelines in place were incredibly intelligent themselves, and they were trying to solve problems that had existed back when they felt there was a need to, you know, modify these laws in the first place. So in order to get any kind of reform, we do have to have an assembly of people who understand this stuff come together and try to create a better system to help solve the problems that we're in now. But I do believe we definitely need that reform. And, you know, if we don't get it, you're just going to see a lot of people trying to side skirt the system, getting married without signing the marriage certificate and all these kinds of things. And that's a problem in itself, too. Anyways, let me know what you think down below. Be sure to give these guys a subscribe. They're a pretty small channel, but, you know, their content is good. And make sure to hit the like button on this video. Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you on the next one.